So today we're going to be looking at top-down mixing, and to be able to conceptualize top-down mixing, we need to look at how we can group instruments together whilst we're mixing. And if we look at this diagram here, we can see that we can make a mix a simple tree-style structure. And at the top of the tree is the overall mix bus. This is where everything is summed together, and we might want to add some processing to everything together. And then from there, it splits out into a number of subgroups. And some people like to do this in more abstract ways, but a lot of people like to separate these into the different instrument groups. So this is a very simple example. You obviously might have some synths and some effects and horns, strings, any sort of instrument group, but as a basic rock track you might have drums, bass, guitar, lead vocal, backing vocal, and these might actually stem off here into another set of groups. So you might have one for kick, one for snare, one for toms. You might have one for rhythm guitar, one for lead guitar, or even just a separate guitar part, okay? And then from there it might even go one stage further where you've got maybe multiple mics on a source. So for instance, on the drums, you might have a kick mic that's inside the shell itself next to the beater, and one on the outside, and maybe even like a NS10 speaker cone as a sub mic. So you can see how these kind of unfold. And top-down mixing is basically the concept of trying to do as much as possible on these higher level buses rather than immediately jumping into each individual channel. So for instance, you would start with top-down mixing on the mix bus, okay, and then from there you would go into your larger subgroups, and then you would keep kind of going down these structures until you got to your individual tracks. Now, the alternative approach is bottom-up mixing, which is probably a little bit more common, which is where you would start on the individual channels and work your way up the structure. Okay, so top-down mixing, you want to conceptualize your instruments in your mix into subgroups, and you want to work at the highest level subgroup first and work your way down. So what does top-down mixing achieve? Well, the theory is that working as everything together and handling the bigger, broader strokes first means that you end up having to do less processing on your individual instruments. Okay, so for instance, if on all of your drums they all sound very dark, actually adding some sort of top-end boost might be fine to do across the whole drums, or maybe just your whole mix is dark, so then you could just add it to your overall mix. So this is a way that you don't have to put the same processing on every single track. It also will help with a level of cohesion. So for instance, and in particular non-linear processing like distortions and compression, this might sound even better when done together because it kind of creates some sort of shared movement. Okay, so the first consideration I make if I want to do top-down mixing or not is actually how well has the piece been recorded, because top-down mixing works best when you're not having to do anything too surgical. So for instance, if you've got these narrow resonances on drums, or you've got lots of like mics on guitars that you need to balance and maybe phase align and do all this sort of prepping stuff, you wouldn't want to start with your top-down mixing until all of that had been done. So for me, in the prep stage, I'm often going through and sorting those phase problems out, summing things down, and getting things to a state where it's kind of ready for top-down mixing. Because if you just turn your mix on, create subgroups and go, you might end up in a mess, because you might be doing some things that you wouldn't have done if you had just spent a few minutes cleaning stuff up. So the better something's been recorded, the quicker you can get to top-down mixing. So let's go into Pro Tools here, and I've got a track, and what I've done is I've already created this top-level mix bus, and I've also created subgroups of backing vocals, lead vocals, synth, piano, acoustic guitar, electric guitar, bass, some sort of various different sweep effects and stuff. We've got percussion, we've got drums, and we've got loops. Okay, so let's just have a listen to the chorus to just get an idea of what the song is.
Welcome to your free world. Welcome to your soul. Welcome to your dream world. Welcome to your home.
So now let's just create a loop of this heavier kind of hook section, and let's just do some top-down mixing. And this is the perfect sort of approach to do when you've got a track like this that's been recorded well and it's been balanced already, maybe some pre-mixing and some stuff has already gone on, and you want to add some broader strokes, and you want to do that quite quickly. So listening back to that, things sounded balanced, they sounded like they'd been cleaned up nicely, and they've also been summed down a lot. However, it didn't have a lot of energy, it didn't have a lot of bounce, a lot of drive, it kind of felt quite flat. And that for me is when you would want to look for top-down mixing. So let's start by adding a bit of like analog character. So I'm just going to look for a tape machine. So I'm going to go for the Waves J37. This is a multi-track tape machine rather than a 2-track that you might usually find on a mix bus, but I kind of like the sound of this plugin, so I'm going to use it. So the first thing I'm going to do is set the level going in, and I'm going to try and set it so that it's around 0, and I'm going to kind of find the harmonic sweet spot. So it might go a little bit above, a little bit below, but I'm just trying to find where it feels best.
Welcome to your freedom. Welcome to your soul. Welcome to your dream. Welcome to your home.
So that felt pretty good when it was just going a little bit beyond 0. So I felt like on the kick and the snare and some other things, it just going into the red there felt pretty good. So now let's change the different tape speeds and the formula to try and shape it a little bit more. So whilst this isn't a video on tape color, slowing down the speed is going to give it more boost in the low end and a higher roll off in the top end. And it's also changing the tape formula here is just going to be changing the character, because this is effectively changing the tape that was used. Okay, so let's just have a listen.
Welcome to your freedom. Welcome to your soul. Welcome to your dream. Welcome to your home. Welcome to your world. Welcome to your freedom. Welcome to your soul. Welcome to your dream. Welcome to your home. Welcome to your world. Welcome to your freedom. Welcome to your soul.
Okay, so there we go. I first changed the tape speed. I didn't like it on 7.5 because I think it made it a little too lo-fi. For some stuff that would be pretty good. And I went through the tape formulas, and I liked the 888 because it kind of retained a bit more top end. And I reduced the wow and flutter. So this is the kind of modulation that happens from a real tape machine, and I wanted to kind of minimize that. So I'm using it more as a creative effect than sounding like a real tape machine. And hence why I wasn't so bothered about using a real 2-track machine, is I'm not trying to go for authentically tape. I'm just kind of creating something that I like a bit more, and I saturated it a touch. So from here, I think that we can move on to some kind of broad EQ. So I'm going to load up a Pultec style EQ. And what I'm going to be doing here is this typical kind of boosting the lows, boosting the highs to kind of create a smiley face curve. And I'm doing it with this tube EQ, which will add a little bit of harmonic color too.
Welcome to your freedom. Welcome to your soul. Welcome to your dream. Welcome to your home. Welcome to your world. Welcome to your freedom. Welcome to your soul. Welcome to your dream. Welcome to your home. Welcome to your world. Welcome to your freedom. Welcome to your soul. Welcome to your dream.
Okay, great. So that's kind of added some bottom and top and done it with a bit of character. Now I'm just going to be actually adding a bit more saturation. So you may have noticed that a lot of what I'm doing here is like tonal and spectral shaping, but I'm also adding a lot of distortion and character here, because this is something that I find that if you handle this on the mix bus, then you have to do a lot less of it on individual channels, and it actually sounds a little bit better overall. So I'm just going to cycle through some of these mix presets, and this is kind of like a tube analog color box. And this has been emulated by Plugin Alliance, so this is the Black Box HG2.
Welcome to your freedom. Welcome to your soul. Welcome to your dream. Welcome to your home. Welcome to your world. Welcome to your freedom. Welcome to your soul. Welcome to your dream. Welcome to your home. Welcome to your world. Welcome to your freedom. Welcome to your soul.
Okay, so that's adding a lot of grit and a lot of character to it, and it kind of sounds a little bit more alive now, whereas it sounded very programmed before. Now it's kind of coming to life. So let's just go ahead and let's load a compressor next.
Welcome to your freedom. Welcome to your soul. Welcome to your dream. Welcome to your home. Welcome to your world. Welcome to your freedom. Welcome to your soul. Welcome to your dream. Welcome to your home. Welcome to your world. Welcome to your freedom. Welcome to your soul.
Okay, so that's adding some kind of rhythmic bounce there, and it's on a slow attack, fast release, so that it's kind of emphasizing the transient part of the sound a little bit more. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add a kind of like widening tool. So this tool, Dr. MS, is great because it can offer some mid-side widening, but it can also simulate analog crosstalk. So these two, focus and field, what these do is they add some of what's on the sides into the center and what's in the center into the sides a little bit. And there's a preset on here that's kind of one of my secret presets. So this analog mix here, and we're going to just start there. It's just got a bit of widening on the sides, and it's just giving a little bit of the field and focus to kind of add a bit of crosstalk.
Welcome to your freedom. Welcome to your soul. Welcome to your dream. Welcome to your home. Welcome to your world. Welcome to your freedom. Welcome to your soul. Welcome to your dream. Welcome to your...
Great, so now let's go ahead and let's turn off all of this processing so you can kind of hear before and after. And hopefully what you were hearing here is that each stage was improving things a little bit, and you know, lots of small incremental improvements adds up to something bigger, which hopefully you'll hear now. So initially we might find that there's a bit of a gain change, and I'll rectify that as I go.
Welcome to your freedom. Welcome to your soul. Welcome to your dream. Welcome to your home. Welcome to your world. Welcome to your freedom. Welcome to your soul. Welcome to your dream. Welcome to your home. Welcome to your world.
So hopefully what you were hearing there is that it just sounded a little bit more plain, a little bit more boxy without the processing on, and everything kind of widened. It felt like more harmonically rich, and it sounded more bouncy with that processing on. And this will have saved us a lot of work on individual channels and hopefully will create a more natural result. So now that we've done a bit of processing on the overall mix, we can now go to the next subgroup levels down, which are all of these instrument groups. And I'm actually going to go ahead and I'm going to start with the loops because I feel like they could do with sounding a little bit more harmonically excited and also a little bit richer. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to load a kind of saturation plugin. I'm just going to drive these quite hard.
Welcome to your freedom. Welcome to your soul. Welcome to your dreams. Welcome to your home. Welcome to your world. Welcome to your freedom. Welcome to your soul. Welcome to your dreams. Welcome to your home. Welcome to your world. Welcome to your freedom. Welcome to your soul. Welcome to your dreams. Welcome to your home.
Okay, great. So I'm kind of pushing that really hard, and I was auditioning this fully wet with it absolutely crushing the sound to kind of get the character I felt was necessary, and then I backed the mix off so that we had a lot of the dry signal going through as well. So now that's done, let's just go ahead onto the drums, and for this stage I just want to try and make the loops and the individual drums just sound more together. So I'm going to play those in solo and work on the drums with that playing. So I want these kind of programmed drums that I've got in individual stems to just sound a little bit more impressive, a little bit bouncier, a little bit fuller. So again, I'm going to do similar things to what I did on the overall mix bus. So I'm kind of taking these a stage further. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to load the HG2 again. And again, I'm going to use another SSL style mix bus compressor and try and just re-emphasize that groove even more. Okay, so that's getting there, but I'm actually going to add an extra level of excitement on top of here because I want just the top end to kind of sparkle a little bit more, and this will help make these kind of programmed drums kind of sit on top of the loops. Okay, so that's feeling better. Now let's bypass it, check that we just haven't changed the gain too much. Great, let's put everything back in and let's start working on some more buses.
Welcome to your feet. Welcome to your soul. Welcome to your dream. Welcome to your world. Welcome to your feet.
And I feel like we could be doing the same sort of things to this percussion bus. So I'm just going to copy across the settings and just see how that works.
Welcome to your feet. Welcome to your soul. Welcome to your dream. Welcome to your home. Welcome to your world. Welcome to your feet. Welcome to your soul.
Okay, so I feel like I can hear the tape machine driving a little bit harder, so I'm going to kind of back the level off a bit.
Welcome to your feet. Welcome to your soul. Welcome to your dream. Welcome to your home. Welcome to your world. Welcome to your feet. Welcome to your soul.
Okay, so now let's add some kind of movement to the bass. So I'm going to put an LA2A on here.
Welcome to your feet. Welcome to your soul. Welcome to your dream. Welcome to your home. Welcome to your world. Welcome to your feet. Welcome to your soul. Welcome to your dream. Welcome to your home. Welcome to your world. Welcome to your feet. Welcome to your soul. Welcome to your dream. Welcome to your home. Welcome to your world. Welcome to your feet. Welcome to your soul. Welcome to your dream. Welcome to your.
So now I think that the guitars and the piano need a lot more work to just try and make them sound fuller. So let's go ahead and start with the piano.
Welcome to your feet. To your soul. Welcome to your dream. Welcome to your home. Welcome to your world. Welcome to your feet. Welcome to your soul. Welcome to your dream. Welcome your freedom. Welcome to your soul.
Now let's look at the guitars.
Welcome to your freedom.
Now let's look at the synths.
To your freedom. Welcome to your dream. Welcome to your home. Welcome to your world.
So I think these need quite a lot. They need to come and fill kind of all of the gaps. So let's go ahead and kind of drive that quite hard with some kind of conventional compression, and then let's add some distortion from there.
Welcome to your freedom. Welcome to your soul. Welcome to your dream. Welcome to your home. Welcome to your world. Welcome to your freedom. Welcome to your soul. Welcome to your dream. Welcome to your home. Welcome to your world. Welcome to your freedom. Welcome to your soul. Welcome to your dream. Welcome to your home. Welcome to your home. Welcome to your world. Welcome to your freedom. Welcome to your soul. Welcome to your dream. Welcome to your home. Welcome to your world. Welcome to your freedom. Welcome to your soul.
And now let's just crunch up the vocal a little bit more. Make it kind of fit into this more distorted kind of category that we've put in everything else into. I'm going to go quite extreme with this and just see if that works.
Welcome to your freedom. Welcome to your soul. Welcome to your dream. Welcome to your home. Welcome to your world. Welcome to your freedom. Welcome to your soul. Welcome to your dream. Welcome to your.
And just to make the comparison a bit easier, this plugin doesn't have an output trim, so I'm just going to go ahead and add one as another plugin.
Welcome to your freedom. Welcome to your soul. Welcome to your dream.
And I think we need to do a similar thing to the backing vocals, but I'm going to use a different kind of less heavy-handed distortion here. Here we go.
Welcome to your freedom. Welcome to
Okay, so that's me going through all of these subgroups and kind of just adding some extra distortion, compression, not so much tonal shaping EQ at this point. I wanted to kind of do that on more of the individual channels, but you can kind of see where we're going. So I'm just going to go ahead and bypass all of this processing, and you can kind of hear where we started.
Welcome to your freedom road. Welcome to your soul. Welcome to your dream world. Welcome to your home. Welcome to your world. Welcome to your freedom road. Welcome to your soul. Welcome to your dream world.
Okay, so hopefully what you're hearing there, it becomes way more three-dimensional. It becomes kind of more harmonically rich in the top end, and it's got a lot more character and bounce about it. And that's the crux of top-down mixing. It's adding analog character and color to things. And from there, I could go through doing all of the individual channels. And there's certainly a need for doing that sort of stuff. For instance, especially on the guitars, you know, some of these funk guitars could do with a little bit of extra grit on them, and some of the others didn't need quite so much. So adding that all in a kind of top-down approach just wouldn't have worked. And the same kind of thing with some of the drums is that particularly the kick drum probably wanted some more transient on the front end to make it a bit more dancey, but that would impact on these kind of hats and crashes and other things that I wouldn't want to do. And because this is quite an electronic style, you wouldn't necessarily have to do so much kind of surgical sculpting of frequency areas, but if this was a live drum kit, you would probably have to go through to all of the individual instruments and do quite a bit of cutting of some resonant frequencies and some extraneous information, and that's certainly something that you can't really do with top-down mixing.